The year was 1944, and the world was at war. In a makeshift field hospital just 3 miles from the front lines in northern France, 32-year-old Army nurse Margaret Hayes was wrapping a soldier's shattered arm when the first shell hit. The explosion sent dust and debris cascading from the canvas ceiling, and the wooden support beams groaned like they might give out any second. Outside, the rumble of German artillery grew louder, closer, more menacing. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd been through worse. At least, that's what she told herself. The young private whose arm she was bandaging looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, and she forced herself to smile. Keep it together, she thought. These boys need you steady. But deep down, Margaret knew something was different this time. The shells were falling in a pattern, methodical and deliberate, like someone was walking them closer to the hospital tent. The wounded soldiers scattered throughout the tent, some on cots, others on the cold ground, began to stir with panic. A few tried to sit up despite their injuries. One man with both legs in splints called out for his mother. Margaret finished tying off the bandage and moved quickly to calm the others, her voice steady and reassuring, even as her heart hammered in her chest. She'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress, and she'd joined the Army Nurse Corps 2 years earlier with dreams of serving her country. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this. Nothing could prepare you for the smell of blood mixed with mud, the sound of men crying in the dark, or the weight of knowing that every decision you made could mean life or death. The second shell hit even closer, and this time the impact knocked Margaret off her feet. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder slamming into the edge of a metal supply crate. Pain shot through her arm, but she pushed herself up immediately, scanning the tent to make sure none of the patients had been hurt. The commanding officer, a gruff captain named Dalton, burst through the tent flap, his face streaked with dirt and his uniform torn at the shoulder. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The Germans had broken through the defensive line, he said, and they were advancing faster than anyone had expected. The hospital was directly in their path. Every able-bodied soldier was being pulled back to reinforce the line, and that meant the medical staff had to evacuate immediately. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Evacuate? There were 47 wounded men in this tent, and most of them couldn't walk. Some couldn't even sit up without help. Captain Dalton must have seen the look on her face because his expression softened just for a moment. He told her the ambulances would be there within the hour to transport the patients to a field hospital 12 miles south, near the town of Beaumont. But they needed to get the men ready to move, and they needed to do it fast. Margaret nodded and turned to rally the other nurses, but before she could take 2 steps, another explosion rocked the ground, this one so close that the tent poles swayed violently. When the dust settled, Captain Dalton was gone, rushing back to his post, and Margaret was left standing in the chaos with 5 other nurses and a tent full of men who were counting on them to get out alive. For the next 40 minutes, Margaret and her team worked with a desperate efficiency. They stabilized IVs, secured bandages, and did everything they could to prepare the patients for transport. The ambulances would come, Captain Dalton had promised, and all they had to do was hold on until then. But as the minutes ticked by and the sound of gunfire grew closer, Margaret felt a gnawing dread settling in her chest. She kept glancing toward the road, hoping to see the convoy of ambulances rumbling toward them, but the road remained empty. The other nurses were starting to look at her with worried eyes, asking questions she didn't have answers to. Where were the ambulances? Were they coming? Should they start moving the patients on foot? Margaret didn't know. All she knew was that if they stayed much longer, they'd be overrun. Then, just as she was about to make the call to start evacuating on foot, a young corporal came sprinting into the tent, gasping for breath. The ambulances weren't coming, he said. They'd been diverted to another sector where casualties were even heavier. There was no other transport available. They were on their own. The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. No ambulances, no transport. 47 wounded men, and no way to move them. The other nurses looked at her, waiting for her to say something, to come up with a plan. But for a long moment, Margaret couldn't speak. Her mind raced through the options, and none of them were good. They could stay and hope the front line held, but that was a death sentence if the Germans broke through. They could leave the patients behind and save themselves, but that went against everything she believed in. Or they could try to move the men on foot, carrying them if they had to, and hope they made it to safety before the enemy caught up. Margaret made her decision in less than 10 seconds. They were going to move every single patient, even if they had to drag them. She assigned each nurse a group of men to oversee, and they started the agonizing process of getting the wounded onto makeshift stretchers, crutches, or anything else that could help them move. Some of the soldiers who could walk, even if just barely, helped carry the ones who couldn't. It was slow, painful work, and every minute felt like an hour. Margaret took the lead, guiding the group down the muddy road that led south toward Beaumont. The sound of artillery was constant now, a thunderous backdrop that made it hard to think. Twice they had to stop and take cover in a ditch when enemy planes flew overhead. Margaret counted heads obsessively, making sure no one was left behind. 47 patients, 6 nurses, and a handful of walking wounded who'd insisted on helping. They moved like a ragged, desperate caravan through the French countryside, and with every step, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She'd always thought of herself as strong, capable, someone who could handle whatever the war threw at her. But this was different. This was life and death in its rawest form, and there was no room for mistakes. After 2 miles, one of the patients, a sergeant with a chest wound, collapsed. Margaret and another nurse tried to revive him, but he was fading fast. She made the call to keep moving, promising him they'd send help back as soon as they reached safety. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the kindest thing she could think to say. By the time they reached the halfway point, Margaret's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her shoulder, where she'd hit the supply crate, throbbed with every movement. The group had slowed to a crawl, and several of the patients were in bad shape, their bandages soaked through with blood. Margaret knew they couldn't stop, but she also knew they couldn't keep going at this pace. They needed to move faster, or they wouldn't make it before dark, and moving through hostile territory after dark was a risk she didn't want to take. She gathered the nurses and the walking wounded and told them they needed to pick up the pace. Some of the men protested, saying they couldn't go any faster, but Margaret was firm. She reminded them that the Germans were behind them, and if they didn't reach Beaumont soon, none of them would make it. Her words seemed to light a fire under the group, and they pushed forward with renewed determination. Margaret took her place at the front again, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The road ahead was eerily quiet, and that made her nervous. Where were the Allied forces? Why hadn't they seen any friendly patrols? For a brief, terrifying moment, she wondered if they were walking into a trap. But then she pushed the thought aside and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. That's all she could do. Keep moving, keep the men alive. Trust that they'd make it to safety. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when they crested a hill and saw the town of Beaumont in the distance. It looked like a miracle, a cluster of buildings bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. They weren't safe yet. They still had 3 miles to go, and those 3 miles could be the most dangerous of all. As they descended the hill toward Beaumont, the first shots rang out. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She yelled for everyone to get down, and the group scattered, diving into the tall grass on either side of the road. The shooting was coming from the tree line to their left, and Margaret couldn't tell if it was enemy fire or a case of mistaken identity. Either way, they were pinned down. She crawled forward, trying to get a better look, and saw movement in the trees. German soldiers, at least a dozen of them, advancing slowly toward the road. Margaret's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the open with wounded men who couldn't fight back. She needed to think fast. One of the walking wounded, a corporal named Jackson, who'd been helping carry stretchers, crawled up beside her. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he asked if she wanted him to return fire. Margaret shook her head. If they started shooting, it would only draw more attention, and they didn't have the firepower to win a firefight. Instead, she told him to stay low and keep the others calm. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She stood up, raised her hands above her head, and started walking toward the tree line. The other nurses gasped, and Jackson hissed at her to get down, but Margaret ignored them. She walked slowly, deliberately, her hands high in the air, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. When she was about 20 yards from the trees, a German soldier stepped out, his rifle trained on her chest. Margaret stopped and called out in the few words of German she knew, telling him they were medical personnel with wounded soldiers. She wasn't sure if he understood, but she kept talking, her voice steady and calm, explaining that they meant no harm and were just trying to reach the hospital in Beaumont. The German soldier stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his finger hovering near the trigger. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the shot that might end her life. But then, slowly, the soldier lowered his rifle and called out to his comrades. Another soldier emerged from the trees, this one older, with the insignia of an officer on his uniform. He spoke better English, and he asked Margaret what she was doing on the road with so many wounded. She explained the situation, how the ambulances never came, how they'd been forced to evacuate on foot. The officer listened, his expression unreadable. Then he did something Margaret never expected. He told her to gather her people and move quickly. He said his unit had orders to secure the area, but he would give them 10 minutes to get off the road before they resumed their advance. It was a small mercy, but it was enough. Margaret thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper, and hurried back to the group. She told everyone to move, and they scrambled to their feet, lifting stretchers and supporting each other as they pushed forward. Those 10 minutes felt like seconds, and Margaret kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the German officer to change his mind. But he didn't. True to his word, he held his position while they moved past, and by the time Margaret heard the sound of gunfire resume behind them, they were already rounding a bend in the road, out of sight. The encounter left her shaken, not because of the danger, but because of the humanity she'd seen in the enemy's eyes. In that moment, the German officer had been just a man, tired of war, making a choice to show mercy when he didn't have to. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still room for compassion. If you're finding this story as powerful as we are, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the forgotten stories of American nurses who changed history, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. By the time they reached the outskirts of Beaumont, it was almost completely dark. The town was quiet, too quiet, and Margaret felt a prickle of unease. She led the group down the main street, looking for the field hospital Captain Dalton had mentioned. But the buildings were dark and empty, no lights, no soldiers, no sign of life. Margaret's heart sank. Had they evacuated already? Had the hospital moved further south? She didn't know, and she didn't have time to figure it out. The patients were exhausted, some of them barely conscious, and they needed medical attention immediately. She spotted a church at the end of the street, its tall steeple silhouetted against the night sky, and made a decision. They'd take shelter there for the night, tend to the wounded as best they could, and figure out their next move in the morning. The church doors were unlocked, and inside, the space was cold but dry. Margaret and the other nurses worked by candlelight, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, and doing everything they could to keep the men comfortable. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Margaret worked, she thought about the journey they'd just made. 12 miles on foot through enemy territory with 47 wounded soldiers. It seemed impossible, and yet they'd done it. Most of them anyway. She'd lost 2 men along the way, and the guilt of that weighed on her. Could she have done more? Could she have saved them if she'd made different choices? She didn't know, and she wasn't sure she ever would. All she knew was that she'd done the best she could with what she had, and sometimes that had to be enough. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of voices outside the church. She sat up, her body stiff and aching from the hard floor, and peered through one of the stained glass windows. Allied soldiers were moving through the town, setting up a perimeter and checking buildings. Relief flooded through her. They'd made it. They were safe. She stepped outside and flagged down a passing lieutenant, explaining who they were and what had happened. The lieutenant's eyes widened as she told the story, and he immediately radioed for medical support. Within an hour, ambulances arrived, and the wounded soldiers were finally transported to a proper hospital where they could receive the care they needed. Margaret watched them go, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. She'd done it. She'd gotten them out. But as the last ambulance pulled away, she realized that no one was celebrating. No one was patting her on the back or calling her a hero. The war didn't stop for individual acts of bravery. It just kept moving forward, grinding on, demanding more and more from everyone caught in its path. Margaret returned to duty the next day, assigned to a different field hospital further from the front lines. She never saw Captain Dalton again, never learned what happened to the German officer who'd let them pass. The war continued for another year, and Margaret continued with it, tending to the wounded, saving lives, and doing her job with the same quiet determination she'd always had. When the war finally ended, she returned to Ohio, to the small town where she'd grown up. She didn't talk much about what she'd experienced. People asked, of course, curious about what it had been like over there, but Margaret found it hard to put into words. Back home, Margaret tried to return to a normal life. She took a job at the local hospital, working the night shift in the emergency room. It was quieter than the war, but the work was familiar, and that brought her some comfort. She married a man named Frank, a mechanic who'd served in the Pacific, and they bought a small house on the edge of town. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Margaret poured herself into being a mother with the same fierce dedication she'd brought to nursing. But the war never really left her. She'd wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced she could hear the sound of artillery in the distance. She'd dream about the road to Beaumont, about the faces of the soldiers she'd carried, about the 2 men she'd lost along the way. Frank understood in his own way. He had his own nightmares, his own ghosts. They didn't talk about it much, but there was an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to carry the weight of war long after the fighting had stopped. Margaret's story, the story of that 12-mile walk through enemy territory, faded into obscurity. There were no medals, no official recognition, no mention of her name in the history books. The army kept records, of course, but they were buried in filing cabinets and forgotten in the decades that followed. Margaret didn't mind. She'd never done it for glory. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do, because those men needed her, and because she couldn't live with herself if she'd left them behind. That was enough for her. Years passed, and Margaret grew older. Her children grew up and moved away, starting families of their own. Frank passed away in 1982, and Margaret found herself alone in the house they built together. She kept working at the hospital until she was 70, long past the age when most people retired, because the work gave her purpose. It reminded her of who she was, of what she'd survived. It wasn't until the early 1990s, nearly 50 years after the end of the war, that Margaret's story began to resurface. A historian researching the experiences of army nurses in World War II stumbled across a mention of the evacuation in an old military report. The details were sparse, just a few lines noting that a group of nurses had successfully evacuated 45 wounded soldiers from a field hospital under enemy fire. The historian, a woman named Dr. Ellen Crawford, was intrigued. She tracked down Margaret's name in the records and managed to find her living in the same small Ohio town where she'd been born. Dr. Crawford reached out, asking if Margaret would be willing to be interviewed for her research. Margaret was hesitant at first. She'd spent so many years trying to move past the war, trying not to dwell on the things she'd seen and done. But something in Dr. Crawford's letter touched her. A genuine curiosity and respect for the nurses who'd served. So Margaret agreed. The interview took place in Margaret's living room, with Dr. Crawford sitting across from her, a tape recorder between them. Margaret told the story slowly, haltingly at first, but as she spoke, the memories came flooding back with a clarity that surprised her. Dr. Crawford listened, transfixed, as Margaret described the chaos of the evacuation, the decision to move the patients on foot, the encounter with the German soldiers, and the long, agonizing trek to Beaumont. When Margaret finished, there were tears in Dr. Crawford's eyes. She told Margaret that what she'd done was extraordinary, that it deserved to be remembered and honored. Margaret shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. She said she was just doing her job, that any nurse would have done the same. But Dr. Crawford shook her head. Not everyone would have made the choices Margaret made, she said. Not everyone would have had the courage to stand up and walk toward enemy soldiers with their hands in the air, or the determination to carry 47 wounded men 12 miles through hostile territory. That took something special, something rare. Dr. Crawford's research was published in a small academic journal, and for a brief moment, Margaret's story gained a bit of attention. A few local newspapers ran articles, and Margaret was invited to speak at a veterans event in town. She agreed, though she felt awkward standing in front of a crowd, telling a story she'd kept private for so long. The veterans in the audience understood, though. They nodded as she spoke, their faces reflecting their own memories of war, their own struggles to reconcile what they'd done with who they'd become. After the event, several of them came up to thank her, and one elderly man, a former infantryman, took her hand and told her he'd been one of the soldiers she'd evacuated. Margaret didn't remember his face, but she remembered his spirit, the determination to survive that had kept him moving even when his body wanted to give up. Margaret Hayes passed away in 1998 at the age of 86. Her obituary in the local newspaper mentioned her service as an army nurse during World War II, but it didn't go into detail about the evacuation or the 12-mile walk that had saved so many lives. To most people, she was just another member of the greatest generation, one of millions who'd served and sacrificed during the war. But to those who knew her story, to the handful of historians and veterans who understood what she'd done, Margaret was something more. She was a testament to the quiet heroism that defined so many of the nurses who served in World War II. Women who faced unimaginable danger and made impossible choices, all while being largely overlooked by history. The truth is, Margaret's story is not unique. There were thousands of nurses like her, women who served on the front lines, who evacuated hospitals under fire, who walked through enemy territory to save their patients. They were there at D-Day, at the Battle of the Bulge, in the Pacific Islands where malaria and jungle rot were as deadly as the enemy. They worked around the clock, often with limited supplies and under constant threat, and they saved countless lives. But their names didn't make it into the history books. Their stories weren't told in the movies and documentaries that celebrated the heroism of soldiers. They were the invisible backbone of the war effort, essential but overlooked, honored in the moment but forgotten in the decades that followed. Margaret understood that. She never expected recognition, never demanded that her story be told. But in the end, her story did survive, passed down through the research of people like Dr. A. Crawford and the memories of the soldiers she saved. What Margaret Hayes did on that day in 1944 matters because it reminds us of something we too often forget. War is not just about the soldiers who fight on the front lines. It's about the nurses, the medics, the support staff who keep those soldiers alive. It's about the people who make impossible choices in impossible situations and somehow find the strength to keep going. Margaret's 12-mile walk under fire was an act of extraordinary courage, but it was also an act of love. Love for her patients, love for her country, love for the belief that every life mattered and was worth saving. That's the legacy of the army nurses of World War II, and it's a legacy that deserves to be remembered. Today, there are memorials and museums dedicated to the nurses who served, places where their stories are preserved and honored. But for every nurse whose name is etched in stone or displayed in an exhibit, there are dozens more whose stories have been lost to time. Margaret's story survived by chance, by the curiosity of a historian and the fading memories of the men she saved. How many other stories are out there waiting to be rediscovered? How many other Margaret Hayes are there, women who did extraordinary things and then returned to ordinary lives, their heroism known only to themselves and the people they saved? These are the questions that haunt us, and they're the reason stories like Margaret's matter. They remind us that history is not just made by generals and presidents. It's made by ordinary people who rise to meet extraordinary challenges, who find courage they didn't know they had, and who change the world in ways both big and small. Margaret Hayes walked 12 miles under fire to save her patients, and in doing so, she became part of a legacy that will never truly be forgotten, even if her name fades from memory. Because the impact of what she did, the lives she saved, rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined. The soldiers she evacuated went on to live full lives, to have families and careers, to contribute to their communities. And all of that was possible because one nurse refused to leave them behind.